I just want to start by saying that I hope everyone's having a great time at the conference, and I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in person. Unfortunately, that's how life is nowadays. But what I'm going to talk about today is one of the studies that I carried out in the past couple of years, and just go through some of the results and how they might be relevant in understanding what psychedelics do to mental health, and also why it might be relevant to categorize them based on their pharmacological mode of action as well. So first of all, I just want to take a moment to introduce myself for people who might not be familiar with my work already. I'm a computational neuroscientist. I work at Imperial College in London, and I've been there for the past 7 years, I would say. And most of my work focuses on analyzing large-scale data sets and using methods such as artificial intelligence for making sense of what happens in the brain. But one of my main interests, which is actually aligned with what I'm going to talk about today, is what is it that drugs are actually doing to the brain? And specifically here, I'm very much interested in what happens to people who use drugs recreationally, in non-therapeutic settings, in naturalistic settings, wherever they want, really. And how are those changes impacting them in the short and long term? So one of the biggest opportunities that I had to actually address some of my interest in this field was by leading a segment of the Great British Intelligence Test. And just to introduce this study for people who might not have heard of it, it was pretty big in the UK a couple of years ago. We partnered up with the BBC, and under the guidance of Professor Adam Hampshire, what we were interested to find out was what is the cognitive structure of the British population. So we partnered up with the BBC, filmed this documentary about it, and through their advertisement, we were actually able to run one of the largest comprehensive studies to look at human cognition in the world. And this all ran online through our bespoke cognitive testing platform, where people were essentially invited to click a link and then play a couple of different cognitive games and answer a few questionnaires. And then what we were doing was sending them their own results so they could see how they compare to everyone else. We were really surprised because we actually had around 500,000 people sign up, and the number kept growing and growing. This started off in December 2019, and you can see here on the figure on the screen that the recruitment went on for around 6 months. And during this time is when we had so many different signups. Now, one of the important mentions here is that we started our study before the COVID-19 pandemic. So when the COVID-19 pandemic hit in around March 2020, like right in the middle of this figure that you see here, we kind of took the opportunity to enhance the questionnaire forwards and to think, well, maybe since we're still running this study, we could actually use it to understand how people react in times of crisis as well. And you're going to see a bit later on how exactly we did that. Now, one of the very nice things as well was that a lot of the individuals who signed up for the study actually wanted to be part of a longitudinal cohort. We gave them the options at the end of the recruitment session, after seeing the results and so forth, to give us their email addresses, and then we may contact them in the future in order to keep monitoring how they are, send them more cognitive tests, and allow them to look at their performance over and over again. Now, the number of people who signed up was 135,000 different individuals. So this is now part of our ongoing longitudinal cohort. And since that point, so since May 2020, we've been in touch with them regularly. Initially, we were in touch with them every 6 months. So every 6 months, we would send an email to those people and ask them, would you like to take more cognitive tests? And also, would you like to answer a few more questions, without telling them what the contents of those questions were necessarily going to be, but sending them the results at the end, just as we normally did. And then more recently, we started doing this recontact once a year. And what you can see here on the top of the screen is how many people answered in response to single emails at different time points when we recontacted them. So we started off in December 2020 with the first recontact, and then June 2021, January 2022. And from that time point onwards, we are now contacting people once a year. Now, this is the time when I came in and I added this segment that was particularly focused on trying to understand how people's drug use who are part of this cohort is impacting their various lifestyles, or how is it that whether there is a connection with their mood, with their mental health more generally, or with their cognitive ability. And some of this research has already been published. This is actually the research that I'm going to be presenting next here, but there's a lot of other interesting projects that are currently in preparation or in review. So I do encourage you at the end to follow me on socials if you want to hear more about that in the near future. But first of all, with such a big sample, the main question is, are there any drug users in it? And since this wasn't a drug-specific study, so people weren't recruited on the basis of whether they take drugs or not at all, how many of them turned out to be one? It turns out that when we look at the lifetime instance of drug use, 1 in 3 people has tried a drug that is not tobacco or alcohol in their lifetime. And 1 in 10 individuals part of this cohort has tried a psychedelic at least once in their lifetime. So that was quite interesting to begin with, because it means that drug use, recreational drug use, was quite widespread in the sample and could allow for some interesting future comparisons. Now, with the COVID-19 pandemic, drug use actually went down. In the UK, we had quite strict lockdowns during the period of time when the study was running, during the 2020 and even 2021 period of time. So this meant that people were mostly stuck indoors and, let's say, they couldn't engage in the normal pursuits that they were doing otherwise. And this is especially important because a lot of the drug taking happens socially, at parties, at festivals, or just generally, it has this social opportunity aspect to it and so forth. For the cross-sectional analysis that follows here, that presents data from December 2020 and June 2021, there were around 30,000 individuals who responded to those particular recontact time points. And only 7.8% of those individuals actually used recreational drugs during the pandemic. That was for a variety of reasons, which I'm not necessarily going to go into, but from a different analysis of this data where I asked people, why did you use drugs at all? It does result that in some cases, it might have been for coping with the pandemic stress and so forth. Sorry. Now, a main question is, what drugs do these people use? And here it looks like a rather complex analysis, but essentially what I've done was to use a data-driven clustering method in order to try to find these data-driven patterns and associations of different drug choices that people might do. What happens is that people don't only take one single drug, and that proved to be one of the biggest challenges that I tried to solve with this research question here, because it seemed impossible at the time to model the effects of different drugs in isolation from one another. And what was needed was to find out a way where the associations could be captured with much higher precision via an analysis such as this one. And I identified 10 different clusters of individuals in this data set. And I want to take your attention to cluster 8 here and cluster 10. And these are the clusters that I'm going to be discussing in a bit more detail in a minute. Cluster 8 is characterized, if you look at the purple here, by primarily psychedelics use, but also if you look at the blue bar, quite a lot of these individuals, the majority of them, were also cannabis users. And I think that's very important to keep in mind. And then cluster 10 here, that cluster was characterized by primarily MDMA use, but also a very large proportion of them also used cannabis. And again, that's very, very important to keep in mind as well. In fact, most people who use recreational drugs also use cannabis. And this seems to be a very important factor that often doesn't get acknowledged in its full sense in research. So next, what I wanted to investigate was how did these people, part of these different clusters, how, in a cross-sectional fashion, what were their moods in December 2020 to June 2021, so after the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic, based on the use of these different drugs relative to people who never used drugs in their lifetime. And the results here represent the effect size differences for each of these clusters after accounting for things like socio-demographics factors, lifestyle factors such as meditation, reading, exercise, or use of alcohol and tobacco. And what you can see is that with the exception of one group, most of the others seem to have higher effect size ranges. Now, higher doesn't mean better mood. It actually means more mood problems for the graph on the left panel. And then if you look on the graph on the right, that looks at the more specific measures of coping with the COVID-19 pandemic and whether participants were more resilient and so forth. Now, if you focus on the red bars here, those represent the effect size differences that are characteristic to psychedelics and cannabis users. And the blue bars represent the ones characteristic to MDMA and cannabis users. And MDMA and cannabis users, just to start off with this ones, were the only group where it was identified that they actually had a lower incidence of mood problems relative to people who never used drugs before. Whereas when it came to the use of psychedelics during this period of time, people had higher rates of anxiety, worrying about different things. They were more irritable, had more apathy, depressive symptoms, problems with concentrations, and overall mood problems, which was very surprising to find because my hypothesis was going the complete opposite way at the time when I was running this. So the next question that I wanted to answer was, well, could this be because of the cannabis? Because if it was that we could model psychedelics individually, then maybe the results would have been different. So I ran a secondary analysis here where instead of using the drug-naive individuals who never taken anything in their lives, I used the cannabis-only group as a comparison. So people who've only smoked cannabis during the pandemic and took nothing else. But even then, the psychedelics and cannabis group did show higher incidences of worrying about different things and higher incidence of irritability and also worse overall mood than the cannabis-only users. And the MDMA and cannabis users, on the other hand, were consistently scoring lower, and they were therefore doing overall better. So there were a lot of questions that I had myself after seeing all of the results of this analysis. And why is it that we might not find the positive associations that were expected based on a plethora of other different research studies? Well, I just want to start off by saying that the associations between drug use and mental health are quite a complex issue in general, and there's not a single straightforward causal answer that can be defined here. This is such a multifaceted problem that has been puzzling researchers for decades at this stage. So trying to infer why we might see what we see from this simply cross-sectional analysis is very, very difficult. I'm actually working on the longitudinal version of this analysis, trying to follow individual people from when we started off our study in December 2019, where we also had measures of mood before the pandemic even started, and then monitor their drug use up until to this post-peak pandemic times. But that analysis is going to be maybe ready in the next couple of months or so. So trying to zoom in on why specifically we might see the effects that we see with psychedelics, because that was the most puzzling bit of this discoveries here. I just want to mention in general that it is believed that anyone who uses drugs generally has lower mood than non-drug users. And to come back to this undissociable causal links here, it's not known whether it's because the people who have lower mood tend to choose to use drugs, either to self-medicate for that or for a variety of other reasons, or whether it is the drugs that are causing the mood. It's simply impossible to tell for sure. But there are more other things that are more specific to psychedelics that might be driving these results as well. So, for example, the context variability is something that I consider quite highly. During the pandemic, it's quite obvious there wasn't this most essential setting for having a psychedelic experience that is so vulnerable to the changes in the environment. But also it's worth mentioning that the cultural context might have played a role. So as I mentioned earlier, in the UK, we actually had quite strict lockdown policies, which was not necessarily the case in other countries. And here, I also want to mention that there are only 2 other studies that have tried to answer a similar question during the pandemic. One was run in the United States and found very similar results to mine, whereas a different one was run in Spain and Brazil. And that study had extremely different results. That's where they found that psychedelics users were actually doing way better and coping a lot better than people who weren't using psychedelics. Now, the cultural context obviously matters, but I also think that there are a lot of other methodological differences that might have influenced the result in one way or another. Another one of those is the way that participants normally get attracted and recruited into psychedelics research. And this is because if in our case here, the study hypothesis wasn't disclosed at all. So none of the individuals part of the study knew that this study was going to investigate psychedelics use whatsoever. Whereas in surveys where psychedelics users seem to be having better mood as a result of their drug use, either they employ a within subjects design looking at the same individuals before and after, or the samples might be very eager and have a lot of positive experience and wants to share that in order to further research and so forth. So I think these nuances might have mattered in one way or another. It could also be that polydrug use, such as the use of cannabis in the majority of the sample, cancels out the positive effects. Or it might be that the positive effects are not actually that long-lived. So this cross-sectional analysis is based on data during December 2020 and June 2021, but people, part of it could have used psychedelics at any point between May 2020 and when we surveyed them during the pandemic. And if it is that we can only see that those positive mood improvements in a within subjects design alone, then this does raise a question about how can we actually bring people on a level in terms of their mood and general mental health with those who never used drugs before in their lifetime. Sorry. And here I also want to make a note. I already discussed a bit the idea of polydrug use and the fact that drug use is dynamic. It changes and people don't only use a psychedelic. So it's virtually impossible to say that we model the effects of psychedelics in isolation from anything else. But also want to mention that there was such a difference between what we found with psychedelics and cannabis versus MDMA and cannabis users. And in previous research where, as I mentioned, there were 2 other studies that have looked at a similar question, one that found similar results to mine and one that didn't. And in the one that didn't, psychedelics and MDMA were actually studied together under the umbrella of psychedelic. I think this is very relevant for the overall topic of the conference because often people want to categorize them together based on phenomenological aspects of these drug experiences. But in practice, since in some of the studies, when they are dissociated and studied separately, it seems that people have different reactions and different short to medium term effects, at least in crisis situations, resulting from each of them. And this could be either due to the actual effects of the drugs, such as MDMA having more consistent positive effects despite of the settings and not being so sensitive to context disruptions as psychedelic experiences are. Or it could also be because MDMA users we only had around 90 people in that particular group. So that was half of the amount of the ones in the psychedelic group. And it could have been that variability was leaning on one side and wasn't representative of the wider spectrum of MDMA users. But these are factors that are necessary to be considered in future research. And in general, a few other considerations for future research, which I derive from working with such a large data set and seeing how the associations and the different effects noted in a study that was conducted relative to such a large control population. I want to restate the fact that we had around over 20,000 individuals who were acting as controls in this analysis, people who never used drugs in their lifetime before during the pandemic. This sheds light on how methodological changes can really affect the outcomes, depending on what questions we are asking as well. And these are just like a list of different recommendations that I think are important for future research in psychedelics, such as trying to be agnostic when recruiting participants, trying to include large control populations to answer the same metrics, and also to record details about use of non-psychedelic drugs alongside, because those might influence the outcomes a lot, and also more generally, their lifestyle variables and so forth. And I always like to end presentations on a note of how we can carry on in this research field by involving the general public as well, who is more and more interested in hearing about psychedelics research and what these drugs are doing to the brain and also using them. And I think focusing on what the empirical evidence says and going with that is of uttermost importance, but also having healthy criticism levels for what the research papers are saying, what us scientists are finding, because science is obviously not perfect. But if anything, I think harm reduction should really be at the center of the psychedelic renaissance. And that is because ultimately, that is what's going to drive people's experiences and people's understanding of this field forward. So I think trying to make more room for discussing those practices is more relevant than ever. I don't know if the party happened last night or if it's happening tonight. I hope everyone's going to have fun there. I like this graph. We've leave the mixing to the DJ, and hope that everyone's going to have a good time. And yeah, thank you for listening, and I welcome any questions you might have.
Thank you. That was a really thought-provoking presentation. And now we have quite good time for questions and comments.
I can't hear them, by the way, so I might have to ask you to reiterate them for me. Sorry.
Yeah, I would ask, what do you think? Do that the role of as a counterculture have any role, or psychedelics as a counterculture have any role in that? Like as a cultural context.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I would say that, for example, in the UK, psychedelics are definitely not as marginalized as they were before, but I definitely see a difference with, for example, how they're perceived culturally from even 10 years ago, before the massive boom in research. And I think when certain drugs are not necessarily culturally accepted, that might impact the experiences of people who are taking those drugs for whatever reason they might decide to do so. And therefore that might have high intertwined relationships with their mood and other outcomes afterwards. Whereas when we look at other countries, such as Brazil or in South America, where I think there is a stronger historical and cultural link with psychedelic substances and other drugs more generally, that people might feel differently about it. There's quite a lot of research papers trying to describe this as well. And that's why I think it's important to make a note of in which country, which sociocultural context the experiences were happening, especially when we think about outcomes like mood, mental health, and so forth. So, yeah.
Yes, hello, and thank you for the presentation. I was just wondering why you decided to exclude the legal drugs, such as alcohol and tobacco, from the study.
So they weren't excluded; they were accounted for in the machine learning model, actually. So alcohol and tobacco are actually widespread across all of the groups, different incidences, but both within people who never use recreational drugs other than these two during their lifetime or during the pandemic. And in each of the different drug use clusters, people were using tobacco and alcohol on different degrees. So essentially, the confounding effects of those were removed in the machine learning model before trying to infer those associations in order to not let them interfere with what we might see with the psychedelics or MDMA and other drugs.
Thank you again.